now. So get ready. All right.
Now it's the time of changes. Now is the time to move on. This is the time for solutions. Feel emotion. Be new is born. Me and me, none of you. Now I'm connected to you. Me and me, none of you. Me new will do it for you. This is the time for solutions. Be new is for you.
Bienvenidos de nuevo al segundo panel desde el canal B-Logistics. Recordamos que el BNew cuenta con un networking digital, por lo tanto podéis conectar con aquellas empresas que sean de vuestro interés y relacionaros con ellas. Bien, vamos al segundo panel porque primero hemos hablado de sostenibilidad, pero ahora nos centramos en la parte logística explícitamente del transporte marítimo. ¿Por qué? Porque es el más importante a nivel internacional. De hecho, el 90% de todo el volumen comercial pasa por el transporte marítimo, desde su historia, que es la más importante comparado con el transporte, por ejemplo, terrestre o aéreo, hasta la actualidad, que se ha producido esta perfect storm, esta tormenta perfecta a raíz de la COVID y posteriormente con el bloqueo de lo que supuso el canal de Suez. Bien, vamos a ver si todo ello ha comportado una crisis en el sector o se trata de una simple tensión que provocará al final un cambio. Se percibe como una crisis, pero al final los cambios también pueden ser positivos. Nos preguntaremos si vamos hacia un nuevo modelo o estamos solo en una crisis. Para todo ello, el panel se titula Maritime Transport Regulation, Sustainability and Level Playing Field, y también recordamos que contamos con uno de los sponsors principales para hablar de ello, que es el Port de Barcelona, y también con Jordi Espín, que es de Transprime, en este caso secretario general de la Transprime Spanish Shippers Council y también al mismo tiempo de la Strategic Relations Manager de la European Shippers Council. Por lo tanto, el punto de encuentro, ¿no?, de los cargadores a nivel tanto de los exportadores como de los importadores con los estados. Y en esta fase, en la de la ley, es donde nos centraremos la primera hora. Después abordaremos también el transporte marítimo, pero desde un punto de vista más práctico. Dos sesiones en inglés, tenéis los subtítulos también en español a través de la app de BNew, pero en este caso, Jordi Espín, buenos días, muchas gracias por acompañarnos y nada, todo tuyo para conectar también en formato digital con nuestros speakers.
Perfecto.
Gracias.
Gracias. Buenos días. Pues decidimos con BNew trabajar para preparar y presentar lo que era el transporte marítimo. Agradecer a BNew la oportunidad de estar aquí para hablar del transporte marítimo, que ha saltado a la primera línea de la opinión pública. Y es un tema relevante y muy importante. Incluso ahora salen noticias en los medios de comunicación, tanto españoles como internacionales como americanos, en que el Black Friday está en riesgo, que la campaña de Navidad mejor que compremos ya porque si no vamos a quedarnos sin producto. Todo ello forma parte de un magma que es importante que comprendamos de dónde sale. Lo que va a ocurrir, no sé si seremos capaces hoy de augurarlo, pero como mínimo sí que seremos capaces de analizar de dónde venimos y dónde estamos ahora, ¿no? Para ello tenemos a John Butler y aquí está Sis. Hello, John. How are you? How's life?
Well, thank you.
Okay, Krista. Hello. How's life?
I'm fine.
Okay.
We have the echo now, but yeah, okay. I'm fine in Belgium.
Okay, that's good. We will start with John. John Butler is the President and CEO of the World Shipping Council since 2015, after serving as General Counsel for the association since 2010. World Shipping Council represents the liner shipping and the container and ro-ro carriers who provide international and ocean transportation in support of the world trade. WSC's purpose is to help and shape the future growth of sustainability, safe and secure shipping industry. So, John, in fact, we are always, or usually, at two sides of the same table, yeah? I mean, we say some things, you say some others sometimes, but the will, in fact, is to understand each other and to find a common ground. what we call the level playing field, no? In that case. So in terms of the global level playing field or the global field, the World Shipping Council has offices in North America, Asia, Europe. What is your global perspective on the pandemic and its effects on the supply chain? What is currently happening according to your view from the shipping lines and from your stakeholders' point of view?
Yeah, Jordi, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's good to be speaking with you again. As you say, we do have a global perspective, and it's interesting. I just spoke with our Singapore office, who participated in a conference over the last 24 hours with a number of Asian countries. And what was remarkable to me was the fact that as diverse as the supply chain is, we're essentially seeing some version of the same problems every place in the world. There's a remarkable similarity in the challenges that we're facing, and it really doesn't vary that greatly by geography. So, there's always a difference in perspective, whether you're talking to an importer or an exporter, or you're talking to a terminal operator or a trucker. But we are seeing really the same challenges in most places. And fundamentally, the way the symptoms present themselves is that in many, many ports around the world, we're seeing vessels stacked up, waiting to come into berth to work the ships, to discharge cargo and load more cargo. And what we have again seen globally is essentially an inability of the landside infrastructure to keep up with the flow of cargo coming in on the ships. And that's not tremendously surprising, I think, because of the base cause of this, which is COVID, we see real restrictions and limitations on availability of labor on a lot of landside operations, whether that's in marine terminals, whether that's truck drivers, whether that's at warehouses. So there's quite a commonality in the impacts on the system.
So you think we are in the middle of a perfect storm in that way, yeah? So many things happen at the same time, so that then we don't have a global solution for moving onward, yeah, or for moving forward.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Jordi, is that while we see similar problems globally, as we all know from our experience with the supply chain and the work that we all do, you have to fix things one by one, right? Because every step in the chain affects every other step in the chain. There's not some overarching simple thing that you can do that somehow fixes this problem globally. And it probably bears repeating, even though it's absolutely obvious. We've never, since the advent of containerization, we've never seen anything like this. We've seen all sorts of situations where we've had local or regional disruptions, some of them quite severe, either because of weather, or conflict, or labor disruption. But there's always a workaround. And those things, relatively speaking, the prior disruptions we have seen have been limited in both geography and in their duration. This is fundamentally different, right? This has gone on for a very long period of time, and it affects the entire global supply chain. So it's not surprising that that we are faced with real challenges in trying to unwind these problems.
Okay, yeah, and then, well, in fact, since at the interaction, the presenter said that we don't know if this is a crisis or if this is just a perception on tensions, because the model is changing. So whomever within the supply chain feel it as a crisis, but maybe it's a shift or a change of paradigm. So what lessons have we learned from the pandemic effects on the global supply chains? Do we need to make operational changes or any regulatory changes? I mean, the regulators should be making some other changes because there is some kind of global regulation all over, more or less. So what do you think that we have learned and what should be done?
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is just putting this in perspective. So before the pandemic hit, speaking in broad terms, the global supply chain was in pretty good shape. I mean, we had more than adequate capacity. We had quite low rate levels. We had increasing levels of service and connectivity really across the world. So things were going in a pretty good direction. What I don't think is the case is that there's some fundamental problem with the supply chain. It was working well based on the demands that were being placed on it. And the problems that we're seeing now are structural. I mean, or rather operational. They're not structural. Okay. The basic structure of the supply chain, I think, is sound. What we have learned is that it's possible to react to a couple of disruptions at one time. But when you have the entire global system disrupted at one time, the impacts of that amplify one another and multiply in ways that it makes it very difficult to recover quickly. I think we will recover, and I know there are a lot of folks doing things every day at each step in the chain, every time cargo is handed off, for example, to try to make those links in the chain work more efficiently. And it's painstaking work, and you don't see huge immediate results from it. But I think people are learning lessons every day on the operational side. On the regulatory side, again, same observation. Things are working quite well up until the time that COVID hit. So the problems that we're seeing today are not the result of a policy failure or a regulatory failure. They're the result of a global pandemic and the stresses that that puts on operations. So I think it's very important to recognize that regulation or lack of regulation didn't cause this problem, and changes in regulation are not going to solve this problem. It's usually quite dangerous to regulate in the middle of a crisis, particularly if you regulate in a way that will affect things long term. The crisis will go away, but you have to live with the regulation forever. And so it's really important to think quite carefully about those sorts of changes.
Well, yeah, regulation should be the framework to set up the relationship mainly, between shippers, carriers, and all stakeholders. I mean, I refer to shippers and carriers because I represent shippers, you represent carriers. So this is why I say to both of us, along as the rest of stakeholders. Do you think there are any trade-offs we can consider between shippers, carriers, and stakeholders that we can all move into that direction to try to stabilize the current situation?
Yeah, Jordi, I think there are. And I think that's, they say never waste a good crisis, right? I think there are a couple of lessons and things that we can operationalize. One thing that's become clear is that better communication and better use of data can help to ameliorate some of these problems. It's not a silver bullet, but the more visibility that all actors in the supply chain have in terms of where's the cargo, when's it going to be to the next place, what can I expect in terms of delivery date? I mean, these are all things that we've been talking about for years, and they've become much more acute over the last 18 months. So, that works in two ways. One is improving the flow of data, and that's done better in some parts of the world than in others. But the other part is just communication between service providers and their customers. And whether that's between an ocean carrier and a shipper, or between an ocean carrier and a marine terminal operator, the more visibility there is, the better. It's hard enough to have your shipment stuck someplace in a terminal for 3 weeks. If you have no idea where it is and when you're going to get it, that makes it that much worse. So those are things that I think everyone can work on together going forward. The other thing that we're hearing a lot of talk about, and it's obviously a commercial issue, and it's not something as a trade association that we get into, but there's been a lot of discussion about the nature of contracts for ocean shipping services. And essentially, the point is that the contracts that have existed in the past have been fairly loose in terms of their obligations with respect to both the carrier side and the shipper side. Essentially, not a lot of firm commitment on either side. And that's frankly because for the past 20 years, it's been advantageous for shippers in particular to be able to switch over into a spot market type situation. Usually conditions favor shippers. And right now, of course, that's not the case. So one of the things we've heard a lot about, and we'll see how it pans out, is both shippers and carriers seeking more commitments, more firm commitments from the other, so that they can plan better in terms of price, in terms of service, in terms of forecasting volumes. And I think all of those things are probably to the good.
Yeah, you're right on this. I mean, usually everyone going to spot market, and everyone going into short-term forecast. In the end, it's not forecasting in a way to, or in a good way to provide stability or some kind of plain path to see what's going to come. We are all, in a way, short-sighted, and we have to remove that from all parts. That's also important. I mean, not the immediate part is the only one which matters. Also to forecast in a nice way and to have an understanding between stakeholders. That's also important. So in this respect, what's next from your side? What do you think? Are there structural issues with liner shipping that make it more susceptible than it needs to be to shocks like COVID?
Yeah, as I said a moment ago, I don't think the issues are structural. I think the issues we're having now are really unique to COVID, but of course, when you expose the weak points, it gives you an opportunity to fix some of them. And we talked a bit about the communication, the contracting, et cetera. One of the things that is becoming increasingly clear, and for example, in my home country of the United States right now, we're having a big debate in the Congress about infrastructure funding, because while we have adequate capacity in terms of ships and containers, et cetera, on the ocean side, provided we can keep them moving, right? Because container velocity is really the issue. It's not raw asset capacity. We have enough asset. What we're seeing, though, is that on the land side, where there's less flexibility, right? It's very difficult to move warehouses and terminals, and these are fixed assets that the supply chain depends upon. There are opportunities, I think, for further structural investment on the land side that would help to soften the blow when we have crises such as the one we're having now. But the other thing that has to be kept in mind is a lot of the problem we're having now isn't really, even on the land side, in terms of, it's not a question of the physical assets not being there. It's a function of not having enough people to appropriately use those assets. We have labor shortages in many places, and whether that's from lockdowns or just disruptions in the labor market associated with the pandemic in general, we have not enough people in warehouses, not enough people driving trucks. Just talked to officials in the UK a few days ago. They have a massive shortage of hauliers, and that has an impact on everything. So I think infrastructure investment on the land side is something structural that requires some attention, as does the labor side of things.
In fact, you're referring to talent as well, Sometimes we think talent is only something that people should study at university, and it's far away from that in practicalities, I mean, it's also job learning and how to do and how to develop and how to perform in critical situations like the one we are facing now, how to react to that, So,
it's probably the single most important thing out there. I mean, you can have all the physical assets in the world, and if you don't have people that can make them work, it doesn't matter. And we see the same thing I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we still have today a real crisis in terms of crew changes and crew vaccination with respect to our seafarers. And this has been, the entire industry has been trying to raise the profile of this and to try to get individual governments to take steps to make sure that we can keep healthy crews on these ships. And it's incredible, frankly, what our seafarers have been able to do up until now. But the fact that they've been able to keep at it and generally keep the ships moving, we shouldn't take that as a foregone conclusion. That can change. So we really need to push on the vaccination side and the crew change side. Otherwise, we introduce yet another serious problem in terms of the velocity of the supply chain.
Okay, and then where's the meeting point? Where do you think the meeting point for shippers, carriers, stakeholders, where do you think we can find a meeting point for the future? For what's coming next now? I mean, where is the point where we can all meet to go into the same direction and try to build some kind of relationship bridge where we can all be oriented into the same way?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The first thing I think we can do is to recognize that this is, the relationship between members of my organization and members of your organization has too often been seen as binary. It's, shippers and carriers, as though those are the only parts of the supply chain. And I think what we have to recognize is that we all depend on many, many other parts of the supply chain, not just one another. The direct relationship between a shipper and a carrier or their carriers is critical, right, to making things work, but it's only part of the equation. So I think it's important for all of us to recognize that we have an interest in those parts of the supply chain we don't control. And that means from a carrier perspective, we need to be interested in what happens at the terminal, what happens with the trucking capacity, what happens with the rail capacity, what happens with our customers' warehouses, because we're seeing in the United States, for example, that customers aren't pulling cargo out of the ports because they've got no place to put it. And that's through no fault of their own, but it's a factor, right? So I go back to what I said, Jordi, a few minutes ago. It all begins with communication. There has to be an open discussion about what does the shipper as the customer need, what is most important, and how do we find a way to provide that service with visibility and predictability in an economic structure that allows for enough investment that all parts of the supply chain can be in a position to reliably provide that service going into the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John. Because yeah, in fact, we are building we are promoting the new pathstones to have a good relationship between shippers and carriers. So this is something that will come on for the coming months. We have started some weeks ago in some meetings, so I hope that we are able to announce this in the future times, that we are, in fact, trying to cope with new relationship and to build something out of it, which is what we need to learn and where we have to head to, yeah.
Yeah, we all have a common objective, and we have to recognize that and work for it.
Yeah, clear. So, thank you, John. Let me shift now to Krista, and then we'll come back to you for some questions that people may be asking. So stay with us, don't move, because maybe then there are some more other things that we would like to talk to you again during the conversation we have with Krista. Krista, thank you. Hello, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you. How I wish to be in Barcelona together with my students instead of a classroom here in Antwerp. This morning, very lovely weather, but now raining. Thank you for the invitation. I hope everything is fine in Barcelona.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, next time we'll try that you are both here and that you can have a chat, a personal chat, which is always much nicer than here from the distance, yeah? So Krista will supply the academic view to John and to myself from the distance, so that's good because she's far away involved, but far away from the current operations and the current discussions we are having. But you have a very wise view, and we are always telling us where should be heading to. So Krista, for the audience, Krista says is holder of the BNP Paribas Fortis Chair Transport, Logistics and Ports Promoter of the Chair Denley Lock Affair with focus on inland navigation. She is a maritime economist at the University of Antwerp and faculty Business and Economics Department, Transport and Regional Economics. So, according to your view, that now that you have me, myself as shippers and John as carriers, blame, according to your view, who is to blame for a current situation? Yeah, and I'm the moderator, sorry, but sorry, I'm not a neutral moderator, yes? So tell us, how is your view? Who is to blame?
Well, it's lovely to look at the screen and to see demand and supply sitting next to each other, and I will give my academic neutral point of view. You need to realize, Jordi, that a crisis has many fathers. We as academia, so I'm not going to blame one or another. We academia look always to a long time series, and according to me, it already started long before the COVID-19. It was correct that John was saying that supply chain was really good, but there were challenges like the trade wars, the Brexit. You need to realize UK's import market, so a lot of containers were already not on the right place due to those elements, and on top of that we had then COVID, the lockdown, and the series of disruptions that happened with the Ever Given, but definitely also from the demand side, the huge, tremendous, unexpected increase in demand, but we will come later with respect to that. The closing of the ports in China resulted in a huge congestion. I heard that today a Danish consultant published that 12.5% of the world fleet is actually stuck, so waiting to arrive in a port. And that's the same as about plus 3 million TEUs that are then not used actually. We as academia, we always have a look at the demand side. So that means we look at exogenous factors, but also to the world economy, and definitely then that huge increase, not yet to stop, also the trajectory. So quite some traffic China, US West Coast, and also have a look at the cost. So for instance, for the carriers, trying to find extra capacity in terms of ship, we're confronted with charter rates up to 300%, and some types of ships actually know an increase of plus 500%. So just to give you some figures. On the other hand, you do know that demand side is really flexible, very sensitive to changes, while actually the supply side is slow in responding, meaning finding extra capacity, new building. It takes 1 to 2 years to build it. So yeah, actually no one is to blame and everyone is to blame, as we all ordered a lot of furnitures and etc., etc.
Okay, so just a small number, a small data, yeah, because now we may be shifting into data for everyone to understand where we are now. So in the global supply chain, is there really a spike in demand and supply, or comparable to previous years, we are at the same level?
Oh, I'm so very pleased that you asked that question, because I had a look at some figures, and I must confess that I forgot that the period 2003 up to 2007, with respect to world seaborne trade, year-on-year changes, it was above 10%. Even in 2004, there was a spike in demand of 13.42%. But at that time, capacity for ships was above the demand. And we saw then pressure on prices, and prices started to go down. If you then compare, because that's another thing that academia do learn from other crises, if you have a look at the 2009 financial and economic crisis, in 2010, for instance, the economy bounced back with 13.7%, and everything worked at that moment. But the economy was open. There was not an issue with ports closing down, etc. If you have a look now, 2021, the demand went up with 6.90%. In contrast to 2009, where there was a drop of 9.5%, now at this moment, but over time maybe it will change, there was only a drop in 2020 of minus 1.16. What is then the difference in situation? That is that the supply is below demand. There was one thing that I forgot to mention. It was not only trade wars, the Brexit, but also the fact IMO 2020, quite some carriers decided to retrofit their ship, and ships were waiting for shipyards, which then closed. And at the beginning, everyone thought, okay, this is a crisis of 3 weeks and everything will be normal. We are now several months later, and that's something that we see. So, like actually John said, there's no an issue of capacity. Capacity is there on the maritime side with respect to ships and containers. There were no shortage of containers at the start of the crisis. It's only due to the pandemic and the closing, a shortage of drivers that then adds to it, that makes that empty containers are really on the wrong position. And now it is easy to say we go for more ships, which we see, for instance, in the strategy of MSC. So they originally started with second-hand ships, so they really target and try to capture as many as possible ships to respond to this crisis. But adding more ships in the fleet means actually more ships waiting before the ports, and that's actually not the solution for the situation that we are in.
Okay, so now that you're talking about containers, containers, everybody faces, I mean for the public watching us, everybody faces there is a problem or a tension, because whenever they want to have a container for loading, the container is never there. So going back to what you said on containers, in fact, they are the main character in this plot, in this novel, yeah? So why do we miss them? And sorry, you just touched it upon a bit, but it's really an imbalance in containers, or it's because containers are not there? What's your view on that?
Well, your question is definitely a question now with respect to capacity. So let's first have a look at the ships before I continue with the containers.
Okay.
A lot of persons forgot that, for instance, in 1969, that's not that long time ago, there were only 3 million of TEU slot capacity on board of ships. Mm-hmm. It was 2005 when it was plus 5.5 million. It took then 2008 until we trespassed the 10 million. At this moment, we have 23 million of TEU slot capacity on ships available, fully cellular ships, and on top of that you have then containers transported on other types of ships like ro-ro, multi-purpose ships, and on top of the ships the containers for 25 million. And it is expected to increase the fully cellular to 25 million and the total capacity to 27. Just to remind you of the figures, that there is an increase and actually no shortage. It's a little bit the same with the containers, yeah? So there were a couple of years ago, they were maybe then in use because there's a 1 to 3 rule, one at destination, one sailing, and one at origin. You had about 175 million, it increased then to 180, to 195. It is expected now to 206 million. But you need to realize that there are only, as far as I'm aware of, 3 very important factories to produce containers. So they are all located in Asia. What we do know is that the intra-Asia market is going to increase. We do see that China is outsourcing to other intra-Asia countries. So the question is, will those containers be used in intra-Asia, or will they be actually used elsewhere? So that's also food for thought, actually, that we have with respect to that. So it is not about missing containers, and it is about missing containers on the right place. Okay. So they are blocked.
Okay, thank you. Because people is the face, the front end is the container, and it's just the bit of the iceberg. So it's important for people to understand why they miss the container, and that's the main point in explaining. Thank you very much for your explanation and for telling us what you feel about that and on your thoughts. The other point is the field. Not even the level playing field, but the field. Do you think that further than shippers and carriers who are here represented, although I insist, sorry, I'm a moderator, but I have an opinion on this. But do you think that the rest of stakeholders, including us, shippers and carriers, did we all deliver after the pandemic? Or you think that there was something that we should have done that was not there?
According to me, yes, all the stakeholders, including the seafarers, also John already referred to the seafarers, they did deliver. And the majority of the ports, the port remained open, and that was really, really important. That's something that we definitely see in North Europe, but we cannot generalize this for the rest of the world. And we see also now the impact of the closing of Chinese ports one after another due to pandemic. You could ask them with respect to the hinterland transport, because it was really cascading effect. You saw it maritime, then the ports, then the hinterland operators. I do know that some shippers opted for a truck from China to Europe to bring their cargo, but that is not sufficient for all the volume that is transported via maritime. The rail connection on the Belt Road Initiative cannot capture the volume that is transported via the maritime, and air was an alternative at some cases. So I think everyone did his best, but issues like, and that's also something that John referred to, if you know that in the US at this moment for 9 trucks and trips and job offers, there's 1 driver. If you heard the situation in the UK, that they are looking for 100,000 truck drivers, and if you see the empty shelves, if you saw the queuing at the tank stations in the UK because there are no drivers to bring fuel to the tank stations, and it's not only to the UK. Sometimes my friends send them pictures to me, and one of my friends, her daughters, is in Brussels. She's staying there as a student, and she took pictures of the supermarket in Brussels with empty shelves. So there are shippers who did not that very good in forecasting, who look to maritime as their floating warehouse, who put a lot of eggs in the same basket, are very dependent on one or few suppliers. So I think there are some things to change, and I hope that, because that's what the word crisis means, also have a look at the opportunities, that a good debate is started up to discuss what needs to be changed.
Okay, thank you, Krista, because in fact, and this, yeah, I mean, from the academia point of view, from your point of view, I mean, whenever we refer and whenever we explain to the general public or to the media, to our members, to shippers, when we express the voice of shippers, we always say that this is happening and that there is a regulation. So the regulation favors that some things that are happening today in the market are happening, are taking place. So my question to you, and later as well to John, do you think that the block consortia exemption regulation is fine, is good, should be changed? Or do you think that a world without the consortia would be better? Because I'm not able to tell, frankly speaking. I'm just asking, yeah? And I would like, if it's possible, that Krista and John tell us your view on this, yeah? Krista, yeah?
Yeah, I'm already smiling a bit, because you know that I like to talk about the consortia block exemption.
That's the million dollar question, yeah?
Yes. Oh, how I wish. Is that my fee that I will receive now? No. Just, stop joking. No, but with respect to the block exemption, you do know that I follow some indicators. And what is now peculiar, I did not yet put it on LinkedIn, but what is now very peculiar is that some indicators turn meaning that there is increased competition instead of lowering competition. So that's quite bizarre to see now. It's the first time over years that the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is changing direction. If you have a look to the instability index, that's another indicator that I follow, you clearly see that it's totally different than the previous crisis. So this is really interesting, and I wish to have time to investigate it in detail. But what I want to add to this is the following. Suppose that in March, or it was April, that the European Commission would have decided to stop with the consortia and the situation that we ended in right now would have happened, it would have been a disaster, because some persons also forget that although it happened in 2016, the bankruptcy of Hanjin, that the effects were still felt in 2020. And then we would have on top of that the abolishment of the stopping, so no longer renewing the consortia. It would have been a really big challenge. There might have been some then carriers reducing the number of lines, connections, maybe bankruptcy, and that's something that the sector could not digest. So that's the one thing. And you see that the market is working, Jordi. You did not ask me with respect to that, but some shippers found another solution. Like, for instance, IKEA, they chartered a ship,
yes.
They bought containers themselves. Yesterday I saw in the newspaper an article of Coca-Cola. It was mentioned on social media apparently that instead of using containers, they put the substance for Coca-Cola in big bags in a bulk ship. There were bulk carriers transforming their ships, or considering to transform their ship to transport containers. So it suggests that it all drills down to demand and supply, and that the market is actually working really well. And I think this is also proven by the Federal Maritime Commission with respect to demurrage and detention, whether they say there's no abuse with respect to that. But that's something that I will tell you next time on a conference, and I hope live then, because we are currently conducting research with respect to demurrage and detention, and it's a little bit too early to tell with respect to that, but I hope in the beginning of 2022 to come back with respect to that.
Okay. John, would you like to add anything concerning this, what Krista said, or your view about consortia or the regulation?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, anecdotally, and I'll be interested in seeing Professor Siss's research that's more structured than what I see. But, you know, I look at the Trans-Pacific, for example, and, you know, just in the last 3 months, we've seen a number of new services, and we've seen a number of new carriers actually enter that market. So when, you know, Jordi, in respect to your question about the EU consortia block exemption, and of course we have similar mechanisms around the world that give some legal certainty to vessel sharing. You know, in times of crisis like right now, I think the ability to share ships provides flexibility that helps to support the fact that we're seeing, you know, load rates in the very high 90s, you know, 98%. In other words, we all know we need to use the capacity we have as efficiently as possible, and every indication is that that is happening. And I think the ability to share vessels helps with that. It's even more important, I think, in times of more usual demand, because frankly, without the ability to share ships, you would not have the same diversity of services and the same number of choices if it were not for the ability to share vessels. You would have, by necessity, if carriers couldn't share vessels, you would have particular carriers focusing on particular routes because they wouldn't have enough demand to keep up capacity on the same broad number of routes that they have today. So, to be blunt, from the regulatory standpoint, I think we should find something else to fight about, because I think the current structure with respect to vessel sharing very much supports an important baseline of service worldwide that we can call on both in times of lower demand, where it expands service offerings, and also times like now, where it allows people to be more efficient in terms of how they use their ships.
Okay. Well, I would keep on talking with you for long, because it's really a pleasure to have this chat at this size with you, Krista and John. One of the questions I would like to place to you both is, we are arriving at the end of the session, but digitization. Do you think that transparency and digitization can be a solution to improve relationship between shippers and carriers? Do you think that further than the regulation, what we discussed now, transparency and digitization will help? John,
Kristen,
for
would you
example.
I give the floor first to John. I'm curious to hear his reaction, and then I will respond. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Jordi, the answer is absolutely. There's no question about it. I mean, I think sometimes people see increased sharing of data as some sort of magic bullet that's going to change everything, and I don't think that's the case. But at the same time, I think, and this is not just my personal opinion, you've heard this said by CEOs of many of our member lines, we have to do more in ocean shipping across the entire supply chain to make good use of data and to provide more transparency, which is a somewhat vague word, but more specifically visibility to everyone in the supply chain, right? And that's in terms of both where is my container today and where am I going to get it? And it's also in terms of things like forecasting. So a shipper saying to a carrier, look, over the next 9 months, I'm going to need this much capacity on these routes, and this is the way I'm going to deliver that cargo. It's not going to be evenly spread. I'm going to have a spike at this time. Those kinds of things allow all parties in the supply chain to plan better how they use their assets, and that can only help. So unqualified yes in response to your question.
Yeah, I like your shifting from transparency to visibility on both sides, and I think that that's one of the key assets, yeah, frankly speaking. Krista, what's your view on this?
Yeah, my view is the following, that digitalization or digitizing is not the holy grail. So it can support, but don't expect too much from it also. And if you then have a look at, I give you an example, a very concrete example. There are apps for the demurrage and detention to pop up and say, oh, you comment demurrage and detention. But is the problem of demurrage and detention solved? No, it is not. So you see, it's not the holy grail, but it can support with respect to that. But if you come to the data and the data platforms and transparency, which is of course transparency of rates, for instance, is key in that area, maybe, and that's something that I explained this morning to my students in the class with respect to legal issues, it's sometimes better not to be so transparent. So that's something to think of, also linked to the legal aspects, and we talked this morning of piracy and other things. So there's food for thought, and paying more attention to legal and ethics is maybe inspiration for your next event to invite speakers to elaborate with respect to that.
Okay, so the good thing of it, in fact, is that, as you said, I mean, digitization is not the holy grail, it's not the goal in itself, but can bring some kind of framework where we all can have a better relationship and deciding on which is the degree for exposure. So that's really an asset to explore. So, as I said before, I would keep on talking with you both for long and long and long, frankly speaking, so I hope to repeat this again personally, either in Antwerp or in Washington or here in Barcelona. Let's arrange the meeting. But for the moment, we have to conclude here. So thank you very much, Krista. Thank you very much, John, for your kindness and for making yourself available today to talk in a relaxed way about the current situation. And I really thank you very much for you being here today.
Thank you very much, Jordi, and always welcome in Antwerp.
Thank you. And I pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Debate, we just heard it. Thank you, Krista. Thank you, John. Gracias, Jordi. Al final, un poco lo que estamos haciendo hoy, ¿no? Comunicación es lo principal que está faltando para poder reflotar esta logística marítima, que al final son dos vasos comunicantes que se han interrelacionado muy bien, sobre todo entre John y Krista, ¿no?
Sí, correcto.
John sobre todo nos hablaba de que esta relación binaria no puede depender únicamente de los transportistas, ¿no?
Correcto.
Y a la vez Krista pues hablaba de esta comunicación, de más seguridad, ¿no? Más seguridad legislativa.
Tal cual.
¿Crees que también falta a nivel europeo?
Yo pienso que hace falta una adaptación a la actualidad
¿Vale?
de esta legislación. Es decir, la legislación existe, está, pero hace falta adaptarla al momento actual. Es de 2009 y adaptarla al día de hoy con transparencia y con un poco más de visibilidad y menos opacidad ayudará y ayudaría muchísimo.
Porque has hablado que la punta del iceberg, ¿no? Son un poco los contenedores,
sí.
Pero Pero al final también la redistribución de estas terminales es más importante todavía.
Sí, sí, correcto, tal cual. Es decir, por eso mismo digo que la regulación, si le añadimos el toque de transparencia necesario, puede ser beneficiosa, pero necesitamos adaptarla al momento actual.
Muchas gracias, Jordi. Hemos escuchado la parte más legislativa, también teórica y académica, desde Anvers, por ejemplo. Ahora volvemos en 10 minutitos, que hacemos una breve pausa, y nos ponemos manos a la obra, con la práctica. Hemos dado algunos ejemplos, como el de Reino Unido que nos comentaba Krista. A la vuelta, más.